Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Aaron Michel in San Francisco. Aaron is the CEO of PathSource. PathSource is the world's largest library of online informational interviews on video, along with a suite of tools to connect the dots between education, career, lifestyle, and budget. PathSource mobile app is actually rated the #1 career app in Apple's App Store right now. Aaron, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I mentioned before we got started, I'm so excited because one of the focuses of your app is really on how to pick your career, and you're also the first app that we've had on the program, so this is kind of cool.
Absolutely. We're all about helping people and changing folks' lives, so I think we're in the right place.
Yes, excellent. Well, so let's start off. I'd love to know what gave you the idea to start PathSource. When did you start it, and what kind of got you going?
Well, I started basically because of a nearly disastrous decision on my part. Back when I was in college, and even prior to college, I had a clear idea of what I wanted to do, and it was entirely wrong. I had this idea that I was going to go into law, and not just law, I was going to go into environmental law, and then I was going to eventually sell out and do corporate law and do some pro bono work for the environment on the side, and it was going to be great.
Okay.
And then, after I graduated, I decided, before I go and spend $150,000 in 3 years of my life in law school, perhaps I should go and do an internship with a corporate law firm, because I'd done some sort of fluffy nonprofit internships, and I'd already applied to law schools and gotten in, but I figured a corporate law internship would really help me understand, is this the right fit for me? And It was the best decision I ever made. Within 1, maybe 2 weeks, it was abundantly clear that this would have been a terrible fit. I would have been bad at the job. I wouldn't have liked the job. In every way, this would have been a indefensible decision for me. And so I ultimately ended up switching gears, and I went to business school and started starting companies. But despite having smart friends and family who were all very engaged in the process of helping me figure out what would be a good choice, I still almost made a decision that would have cost me 3 years and $150,000. And I said, geez, if this can happen to me, I bet it probably is happening to a lot of other people. And in fact, in all sorts of different scenarios, the answer is yes, it is. It's a huge screaming problem across the country, both for people who are just coming out of school as well as for people who are have been in their career for a little while and are now trying to figure out, where do I go next? Maybe this wasn't quite the right fit for me. What direction is really going to satisfy me on a personal and professional level? And so that's really what brought us to where we are today.
That's super interesting. I think you're right, because in a lot of cases, we're forced to decide on, graduate school or the career path before we've been exposed to it. So it's almost like getting married before dating, and you kind of don't know what you're getting into.
That's right. And what you also often see, and we often get people applying to PathSource who have done this. We see people who have spent huge amounts of money getting a master's degree that actually doesn't help them get the job that they want.
Oh, yeah.
And that is just devastating, right? And it's very, very common, because all of these courses and all of these master's programs say, we're going to do such wonderful things for you, but if you don't really understand what skill sets you need for the job that you want to get, and maybe you don't even know what job you want to get, you just shouldn't be spending tens of thousands of dollars on a master's program. And so we really try and help people figure it all out from the start and say, where do you want to go, and what's it going to take to get there?
Absolutely. Well, I have one quick side question, which is, what did you study in undergrad?
I got the most useless degree you can possibly imagine. It was called Environmental Policy, Politics, and Law. It was in this weird high honors program where we could essentially study whatever we wanted to and name our own degree. And I could have named it astrophysics if I wanted to, even though I hadn't taken any astrophysics classes. But we could put any title on it we wanted, and I put a title on it that was only useful if I wanted to go into law, which at the time I thought that I did.
Oh, well, that's cool. It sounds very creative in a way. So as I mentioned when we got started, one of the really cool things I liked about your app, and I actually have it pulled up right now so I can look at it as we talk, but you offer a thing to help people figure out what's the right career for them. And actually, if you're looking at the app, it says find a career. And it's like a button that you push. So can you help us understand how does this process work when we go and we work on the app?
Sure. So the first thing that we try to do is gauge our users' intent. What is it that brought you there? Is it first and foremost that you want to find a career? Are you looking for an educational path? Or are you just trying to find a job? And most of our user base is there trying to figure out what career they ought to be going into next. And for them, that process will usually take them through a couple of steps. One, we'll take them through a lifestyle assessment, which is basically a tool that's going to ask them a number of questions about what their lifestyle currently looks like or what they want their lifestyle to look like. And then through GPS, we'll know where they're located, and we'll say, okay, in order to have the lifestyle that you want to have, localized to where you live or where you want to live, here's the minimum annual after-tax salary that you need in order to achieve that lifestyle. And then we'll layer that on top of an interest inventory, a career assessment where we're going to ask you a number of questions about what sort of career you want to have. And based on that, we're then going to give you an output that says, all right, here's a set of career recommendations, and we have sort of, it feels a little bit like Tinder for careers.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to give you a set of career recommendations, and you're going to sort of swipe through those, and these are all based upon your career interests. And then we're going to be able to tell you, okay, you're interested in these 5 careers. Here's which of those careers are going to support your lifestyle and salary needs based on where you want to live. And then the next step is that we'll say, all right, well, out of these 3, pick one, and you'll be able to go in and choose one of those careers and really do a deep dive. And we're going to give you informational interviews on video with people who are in those careers. So we've actually built the world's largest library of informational interviews on video. We film them all ourselves. They're not off of the internet. And you go in and you're able to hear sort of bite-sized 2-3 minute pieces from people talking about what they do, what they wish they knew when they started their career, what their career and educational path was. We did a number of focus groups to figure out exactly what questions we ought to be asking and how to structure these videos. And so they're all standardized, and each of them asks 7 questions to really kind of get at the core of what is your life going to look like if you go down this path. And then the last piece of that is that you're able to then go in and do a really deep dive into an ecosystem of data, localized cost data, localized salary data, get an understanding of what sort of education you're going to need to go into that career, how much will that education cost, really giving you a full wide-angle lens into what it's going to be like if you go down that path and what you'll need to do to get there. And then we have a number of other tools, a resume builder and a job board, all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, that's cool. I think one of the best ways that someone can figure out what they want to do is actually, setting up informational interviews. But one of the hardest things about informational interviews is getting people to, to find a time in their schedule that works for them, and then also to locate people who do the kind of job you're interested in. So the thing that's so interesting about your app is that given that you have this library of video informational interviews, first of all, you can look through and find, someone talking about their job without having to set up a meeting. But I think secondly, it may also give you an idea of what you should ask if you do go to a real live in-person informational interview.
That's exactly right. And, oftentimes you don't have direct access to people who are going to be able to, take 10, 15 minutes of their day and tell you about what their job is like. And one of the great things that we found in these videos is that the interviewees are really willing to open up and kind of tell you the gritty, authentic, honest truth about what their day-to-day lives look like in their jobs. And that's really what you need in order to make a good, thoughtful decision.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you talked a little bit just then about lifestyle and kind of figuring out the kind of lifestyle that you want and the type of job you would need where you live in order to have that lifestyle. When you talk about lifestyle, are you primarily talking about the income that you need to maintain a certain lifestyle?
Right. So when you go through the lifestyle assessment, we're going to ask a number of questions about different elements of your lifestyle, and those range from, do you rent? Do you own? Do you, how often do you go shopping? Do you eat in or do you eat out? Things along those lines, so that we can estimate, okay, if you put all of these pieces together, and if you live in Charlotte versus you live in Manhattan, what are your overall costs going to look like? Mm-hmm. And then let's map that onto what careers are likely to actually help you support those types of expenses.
Yeah, that's really smart. I think sometimes we miss that piece when we pick the career, and there can be a mismatch at times. Well, there's another piece in the app that I like. It's over on the right-hand side called the Career Filter. What is the Career Filter, and how does it work?
So it's another way of skinning the cat. It's a way to get at what careers might be a good fit for you without looking at career interest, right? So it takes a very different approach, and we're going to ask you questions like what your educational level is, what sort of salary you're looking for, what sort of personal traits you have, whether you're looking for full-time or part-time jobs, and use that sort of filtering process to help you narrow down to a set of careers that may be a particularly good fit for you. So it's sort of a fun, useful, interesting way to look at what careers might be a good fit, alongside looking at it through the prism of, geez, is this a good fit for my interests?
Yeah, exactly. So I looked at it, and a couple of the top things that you pick are sort of the salary range that you're looking for and your educational requirements. So I picked a fairly high range here, and I picked master's degree, which is what I have. And when I click to check out these careers, one of them that popped up, let's see, compensation and benefits manager position was one that came up, a software developer, a biomedical engineer, an economist. So there's quite a few that pop up, and then it looks like they have a sort of a rating, a star rating up to 5 in terms of how well it fits with sort of my requirements, my filters that I selected. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and it's helpful, I think, for expanding the top of your funnel, right? Mm-hmm. When oftentimes we come in with a very specific notion of what we want to do, and usually that's a good thing. But sometimes that specific notion is wrong, as it was for me when I thought I was going to become a lawyer. And so there's value in taking a look at the question of careers from an alternative angle. Mm-hmm. And that's really what this is intended to do, to give you a pretty broad range of careers that are not directly tagged to your career interests, but rather to all of the other things that are important to you, to help you kind of think, geez, what career should go in the top of my funnel before I narrow down to the one or two that are really going to be the right fit. Let's kind of think broadly about what my opportunities ought to look like.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's really interesting. So on top of being the CEO at PathSource, you also write for lifehack.org, where you're a columnist. And I was checking out some of your columns. One of your recent columns was 5 tips that'll make you rethink your job search. And so since most of us are actually looking for a new job, what do you think, would help make us rethink our search? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, so, I point to a few things. One is certainly the use of technology, right? And I can't help myself here. It's a good opportunity to say, start with PathSource. It is a unbelievable tool, but there's also, a range of other good tools that are out there, and it's really worth, not just doing online research, but seeing what sort of apps and what sort of other opportunities can help you understand, what may be out there for you. And then, two, looking at it with a wide-angle lens up front. So coming in and saying, all right, well, what is the broad range of different career opportunities that I should think about, and think about that in relation to your interests. And ultimately, you do want to narrow down and narrow your focus. But you start big and then narrow down to ideally one or two jobs that you're really focused on and interested in, and then use that process to say, all right, I'm going to go after only these jobs, right? Don't carpet bomb. What you find so very, very frequently is that people will apply for every job that they can find. And as somebody who is sort of constantly in the process of hiring, I can't tell you how annoying this is, and the fact that when somebody applies for a job that it's just abundantly clear that they're not a good fit for, that resume won't. It's a waste of your time as somebody who's applying, and it's a waste of the employer's time, the hiring manager's time, because if you're not sort of tailoring your application to a given job and you don't have the right set of skills, then it doesn't make sense for you to apply, right? If you really want to say, what's a good fit for my interests, and what's going to be, something where I can make a compelling case, even though I may not have been in that industry previously, but that I learned appropriate skills in my previous industry and can learn the relevant new ones, and really go into that in a thoughtful manner, as opposed to, well, I'm going to apply to every job I can find on Monster. So I'd say that those are sort of the key elements of it. Bringing that focus, as well as using networking as well, right? The vast majority of jobs are found through someone that you know, and so pulling your network in, using LinkedIn, all of those pieces, of course, end up being very relevant and very helpful.
No, absolutely. And I think that makes me think back to what you said about starting with a really wide funnel as you're starting to look. But that wide funnel is the part of the process that you're kind of doing on your own. It's part of your research. By the time that you're actually applying, you want to have really narrowed that down so that your career interests really align well with your background and your skills and that kind of thing. Yep,
that's exactly right. You're not applying yet when you're at the top of that funnel.
Exactly.
You want to apply at the bottom of the funnel.
Exactly. Well, you've also written about picking the right career on the very first try. And when you give advice on this topic, is it similar to what you just talked about in terms of, rethinking our job search? Or are there other tips that we should also consider?
Yeah, sure. So there, obviously, I'd say thinking about what really interests you, not just what other people are telling you to do, ends up being super, super important to trying things, right? So the informational interview piece ends up being very useful. If you can actually get real informational interviews, that's fantastic. Using the PathSource informational interviews is great, but being able to talk to people who are actually in those jobs and say, what do you wish you knew when you started going down this path, that ends up being, I think, very, very important. And in terms of kind of trying things, whether these be in an internship or job shadowing, that I think also has immense value, right? Ultimately, if you want to be a nurse and you don't like blood, that's a problem. So
that is a problem.
Right. And there's often times where we like the idea of jobs, but we don't actually like the jobs themselves. And so trying to find a way to experience what it's like to be in that job as much as possible before you make the leap is going to be of value.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so when we first started talking, you mentioned part of how you decided not to go into law was that you did an internship with a law firm, I believe. How did you decide in the end? I mean, what led you towards starting companies?
You know, after I left school, I didn't immediately jump into starting companies, but I had a number of ideas. I went to work as a product manager, and sometimes you just feel the entrepreneurial itch, and I had moved at that point out to the West Coast into Silicon Valley, and particularly when you're out here, and everyone around you is starting companies, it's hard not to get that desire to go out on your own. And so, it's one of those things where if every day you wake up and you say, this isn't quite what I should be doing, I really ought to be doing something else, and you've got a vision for me in your head of where you want to go, at some point you've just got to pull that trigger.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you get the sense, like in the sort of San Francisco area where you live, do a lot of people have full-time jobs but then also kind of work on a side business at the same time?
I think that is very, very common out here. That said, I also don't think that works very well. What I've seen far more often than not is that the folks who will try and start a business on the side generally don't succeed, because starting a business is such an extraordinarily time-consuming process. It really, if you're doing it right, it should be sucking every last ounce of your energy.
Yes.
And so, the folks who I've seen succeed and build really exciting businesses have done so because they've kind of taken the leap. They said, all right, well, I've got this much of savings and I can rack up this much on my credit card. I'm going to give myself this 9-month period to try and make a go of this and raise some money, and we'll see if I can do it or not. And they leave their jobs and they dive in and make it happen. So that is a difficult thing to do. And in my case, it was actually 2 years before we raised funding and really were able to kind of scale things up in an aggressive way. But it takes a long time, and it's not an easy decision, and it shouldn't be. It's not an easy process.
I think that's a really important message for those folks who are kind of debating between a full-time job and starting a business, especially if they've never had a business before, is just how much endurance it kind of takes, how much grit, to get that business off the ground and just really sticking it out until you cross 2 or 3 years and things start to make sense. It's really, really important. The other thing from your story that I'd just love to touch on before we move on is that you were able to move from the East Coast to the West Coast. And I talk to people a lot who are really interested to move to California in particular. And they live in other places like Tennessee or, just different states in general. And they're really not quite sure how to make such a big transition, especially later in their career when they already have a full-time job and they're looking for another full-time job, but it's far away in California. Do you have any tips based on your own experience? Like, how were you able to find something across the country and make such a big move?
Sure. So, I looked for opportunities before I jumped. So I only moved out here once I had a particular job offer, and that job I found through networking, through reaching out and getting connected to someone who is looking for somebody with my specific skill set. So I would certainly recommend that's a worthwhile route to go. The other thing it's not PC to say, but the other thing to note about sort of Northern California, the Bay Area, is that there is a degree of ageism, right? If you're the people who are most sort of popular in the startup industry here are if you dropped out of college and you're 20 years old wearing a hoodie.
Right.
And that actually is a thing. And so I think there's value in trying to figure out if you want to find a job out here, reaching out and doing all of that job searching before you actually make the move. Or alternatively, if you want to start a company, ultimately, if you build an exciting business, doesn't matter, what age, sex, nationality you are, there's going to be people who are going to want to invest in you. But I think, there's a certain profile that some VCs will look for that doesn't benefit somebody who's, in their later 30s or 40s. And that's unfortunate, but it's also kind of a fact of life.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good point. It's a good point. It's something that I don't think anyone has taken the time to actually say on the podcast before, so it's helpful. Well, so I saw another piece that you wrote where it was in 2015, and you wrote that 19% of employees had trouble making ends meet every month. And I know that both as a CEO and as someone who's been an employee before, you've certainly had experience with negotiation, and in particular salary negotiation. I'm wondering what tips you might have for us on negotiating a better salary.
Yeah, well, so the first thing is that it is okay to ask, right? I think a lot of people are very nervous about asking once they get that initial offer. They sort of say, geez, if I push back on this, maybe the offer goes away and they're going to give it to someone else. And that's scary. But really the vast majority of employers are in fact going to kind of expect you to make that ask, and it's entirely okay to do so. Now, there are going to be some jobs where, for different roles, they're going to have to say, well, this is the salary that we have set aside for this role, and there's no wiggle room, right? And there's those jobs certainly do exist, but for most jobs, you're actually going to be able to usually get a little bit of a boost if you ask, and if you do it in a kind of thoughtful and respectful way, your employer may actually respect you more if you ask. I went through a process with one of our employees where she negotiated for a better salary, and the way that she went about it, I thought was very, very sensible, right? She said, "Look, here's what my cost of living looks like. If I'm at this salary, then I'm going to have to live a little bit farther away, and then I'm going to have to drive farther. I won't be able to spend as much time in the office." She went out and found reliable third-party benchmarks and made a compelling argument for why she needed a higher salary. And so I think that sort of process where you're not just saying, well, you should give me a higher salary because I want a higher salary, but you should give me a higher salary because here's some benchmarks for you to look at. Here's some data from Glassdoor in terms of what this role usually brings. Those types of things will allow you to have a really thoughtful conversation where it's not just give me more money because I feel like it, but I think this this compensation package should look a little bit different because here's what the benchmarks are in the industry.
No, that's great. And I really like your example because you're talking about it in a totally calm way. You describe this woman as, I think, thoughtful and sensible, the way she described it. And it sounds like you came away having more respect for her. So I think that's a really great example for those of us who may be listening and kind of struggling even to get started on the negotiation because we're afraid to ask. It's nice to hear in your voice that was viewed by you as something that was a positive experience with this woman.
Yep, that's right. I definitely came out of that process with a greater respect for her negotiating skills once it was done.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really good. Well, so I was looking on your website a few days ago as I was getting ready for today, and I noticed that you're actually hiring at PathSource. I know you have a couple of different positions, it looks like, and I'd love for you to describe for us what kind of person would you love to see apply to come and work at PathSource?
Yep. So, right now the primary role that I'm trying to fill is is a marketing role, and we're looking at it sort of a broad variety of different types of folks. To be honest, we're still sort of going through discussions internally about exactly what's going to be the right fit, and what we're looking for there, which is not as helpful to your listeners as I'd like to be. But what I'd sort of suggest is, we're looking for someone who has real experience building a B2C business, ideally something that, an app-based business, looking for experience in iOS and Android, and looking at growth, how to scale from getting hundreds of thousands of users to getting tens and millions of users. So that's really what I'm trying to hunt down, and it's not as tight of a job description as I'd like, but that's sort of the job description. In terms of the type of people, one of the things I'd sort of point to is the culture that we've developed at PathSource, where what we've really tried to build is a culture where when we disagree about a path forward, which we do constantly, that we bring that out in the open, right? There's we often say, geez, I think X and you think Y. Well, how are we going to resolve that? And first thing is to make sure that we know exactly what that issue is of disagreement, and then we say, well, is there a way that we can approach this where we can test your hypothesis versus my hypothesis, right? If you talk about your views in terms of these being hypotheses as opposed to these being beliefs, it becomes a whole lot easier to say, well, okay, my hypothesis was wrong and yours was right, as opposed to if it's, well, I believe that this is right, you become emotionally attached to it, which is not what we want. So we look for ways to test, and then if we can't find a good way to test those hypotheses, then we argue it out through logic, and we have never come to a place where we say, geez, we can't get past this. We always are able to find a way forward, and then we grab a beer. Right, and so that's the sort of culture that we've got, and so that doesn't appeal to everybody, but we look for the type of people who love that, who sort of say, geez, I love being with a group of very smart people who enjoy kind of banging their heads together and coming out with the best possible outcome.
I love that. I was just talking with someone about this very issue last night, and for myself, I've worked with a number of different kinds of organizations, but having a background in both digital and engineering, this is my favorite kind of environment because everyone's viewpoints are valued, and it's kind of like you debate it out and then the best idea wins. And it's not about who's got the idea. It's about what's going to, be best for the users or generate the most revenue. It's really measurable, and it's motivating, I guess you could say.
Yep. That's I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, so if listeners are interested to learn more about the PathSource app, or maybe they want to apply to this position that you mentioned on PathSource, where should they go?
Sure. They can go to pathsource.com. So the website has information on both roles as well as how to download the app. We now have the app available on iOS as well as a scaled-down version that we just released on Android. And so your listeners can also go directly to the Apple App Store or to Google Play to download the app as well.
Oh, that's so exciting. It's tough when you have to develop two versions of the app. I know that takes more work than people think about. So congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Aaron, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great. I've really enjoyed learning more about PathSource.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to Angela@CopelandCoaching.com. You can also send me your questions via Twitter. I'm at Copeland Coach. And on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.